Welcome to the Immigrant Dilemma podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I hope everyone is safe in this coronavirus time. I'm taking the opportunity to work on more episodes for you and share more knowledge with you. Usually I publish one podcast per 2 weeks, but this time I decided to publish a surprise one in which I'll be talking about two themes that I'm passionate about. I'm literally obsessed with these two stuff. I love it. I could talk about it for days. It's just crazy. So let's talk about natural hair and immigration. First thing first, what is the meaning behind natural hair? I want anyone from any background who's listening to this podcast to understand what natural hair means and what's the explanation behind it. So let's talk about the natural hair movement. It all started in USA a few years ago, and believe it or not, it's been about 5 to almost 10 years. It's crazy how time flies. So basically, the natural hair movement was all about black women mainly, and anyone who used chemicals to either straighten or soften their hair in order to fit in society's beauty standards. Is this new? For some of us, it's not new. It has been here for centuries. It's just part of our culture. So overall, the natural hair movement, it's for people from tighter curl pattern to looser ones. So basically the goal was for us to love ourselves. Why? Because we were taught that straight and soft hair were better, period. It was all about the good hair mentality. So society decided that this hair type is good and this other hair type is bad. Period. No question about it. That's what it is, that's what it was, and that's what we're trying to change. Because most of us now are just tired of using chemicals. We just decided to stop using chemicals and start transitioning into our natural hair type. So we're basically going back to the roots. So the most important part of this journey is that we're learning how to love ourselves and love our natural curl patterns. That's basically it. So in this entire podcast, I'm going to talk about the history first, basically the meaning of hair in African history. So I'm going back to the roots. I'll also be talking about the comparison between two important movements in the black hair history. It will be all about the first movement of afrohair with the Black Panther in the 70s, and then I'll compare this with the natural hair movement in the 21st century, basically what I just talked about. And then there's one thing I really want to share with you today because I feel it's not expressed enough on the internet yet. It's the Caribbean people mentality about curly hair. It's just crazy. We need to talk about this. I feel we have to. It's a must. It's just crazy. And obviously, to conclude all of that, I'm going to be talking about the connection between natural hair and immigration. So this is the title of the podcast. I'm definitely going to be talking about this. Don't worry. I just don't want this podcast to be too long, so I'm going to split it in two parts. So let me tell you what the parts are going to be. In the first part, I'll be talking about the history of African hairstyle and what it portrays in society. In part 2, that's where I'll be comparing the meaning of the two important movements related to black hair in the 70s and 21st century. And then I will conclude by talking about the Caribbean perception of curly hair. So stay tuned. Now let's talk about history. So I'm going to be talking about hair in African civilizations. Here my source is Wikipedia. So believe it or not, as early as the 15th century, different styles could indicate a person's, guess what? Marital status, age, religion, ethnic identity, wealth, and rank within the community, so basically social class. It is really interesting to understand the meaning of hair in the African civilization and how important it is for the African civilizations. But after that, we also understand hair had a cultural and spiritual importance for Africans. So basically, the practice of having their heads, for example, later in history during slavery, because the first thing the Europeans did when they brought them to the Europe continent is to shave their hair. So basically they knew that they were getting rid of all their culture, all their status, all everything by shaving their hair and also to make them look alike. So let's be clear on that. The Africans that were brought to the Europe continent, they were not slaves before. They became slaves. So they had their own meaning, own beliefs, own way of seeing things, and then they just came to the continent of Europe and lose everything. It's just crazy. When I read about this, I'm just like, wow. So shaving the hair, it is such a bad act because hair is so meaningful for the African civilizations, and we're going to understand this today. That's why I really wanted to make sure to go back to history so we can understand the roots of what's happening today with the natural hair movement, what happened in the 70s, and etc. So, for example, for the African Americans in USA, hair straighteners, straightening your hair, it was a process to afford class mobility within the community. It is basically a social acceptance by the dominant culture. So that's really why I'm going to history for you to understand the roots of African civilization with the meaning of hair, and then to understand what happened during slavery. But there's that relationship as well between natural hair and immigration later on. So like I mentioned before, the natural hair movement started in USA with mainly African American women, but it also had a huge impact in the world, especially in Black women community or Black people in general community, or now anyone with any type of curl pattern basically. And also I feel like since in the Caribbean it's really a mixture of European and African cultures, there is also a huge impact in the Caribbean people mentality of curly hair. So that's why I want to end this timeline with the Caribbean mentality, Caribbean people perception of curly hair. So my timeline is really like going back to history, talking about the meaning of hair in African civilization, going through slavery and in the Europe continent, and also North American continent with the USA in that case. And then after going to the African American need of social acceptance in the dominant culture, but also I want to talk about that same mentality the African American were dealing with dominant culture. It also got transferred to the Caribbean. So basically, me that grew up in the Caribbean, or half of my life in the Caribbean, I also had the mentality of fitting in a dominant culture, but I was just not living in a dominant culture, basically. So that's the funny part of it. I was in a Caribbean country with other people with curly hair or any curl pattern type or curl pattern. That's what's funny about this. It's just like I was not in dominant culture. So that's why when I immigrated to Canada, I understood all this with an external point of view. So that's my way of connecting natural hair and immigration, because while I was in the Caribbean, I was not aware of all this. I had to go out of my society and my community to understand this. So that's really the timeline I really want to go with this in this podcast. And I wanted to start with the history. I hope you really understand the timeline and also the roots of all this natural hair movement or afro hair movement, no matter how you want to call it. Stay tuned. When I did my research, I really understood so many things. How important it is to understand how Black hair types have been such a big topic in history and also within our community. The meaning behind it is so deep that it follows us everywhere we go. So even when we change country, we immigrated somewhere else, it follows us. So that's really what I wanted to portray in here. But later also we'll understand how immigration has been a trigger in accepting our natural hair. For some of us, I mean, I'm part of these people. Like, immigration for me, it is such a big trigger for so many things. We will also realize how the mentality of African civilization on hairstyles have been part of Caribbean society's roots as well. So further in part 2, that's exactly what I'm going to be talking in details, and we will acknowledge the similar realities between African descendant individuals living in countries with dominant cultures and Caribbean individuals in Caribbean countries. So in conclusion, globalization is the center of it all. So we feel like it's just African American going through this, but no. Us too in Canada, we're going through the same thing, and even in the Caribbean, we're going through the same thing. It's just like USA being the influential country, and also that's where it started, and with the history of African American in USA too, it's just like very heavy, but it had such a huge impact on us after in other countries as well, including in the Caribbean. So it's all connected. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Stay tuned for part 2 with more details. If you have any question and you want to give me some feedback, you can always go to my Instagram page, Ninickbiss, NINICKBISS. Thanks again. Have a great evening. See you.